Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin.
And I'm Bobby Mixa.
And today we are delighted to be joined by Fen de Villiers, who is a sculptor based in Antwerp in Belgium. He's someone whose work that we have followed for some time now, and we're just really happy to have a chance to sit down and have a chat about art, about who knows what, philosophy, the state of culture in Europe and the West, and much more. So Fen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, chaps.
So good, as I said, to have a chance to connect. I think, Fen, the first that I encountered you and your work was when I read an interview in 2022 that you did with the European Conservative. And I really, really enjoyed the interview. And I thought at the time, my goodness, I don't think I've ever encountered, or it was such a breath of fresh air, I suppose, to put it, that I learned of you and your work, because not only was it made clear back then in 2022 that you were sort of, bucking the establishment a bit, you were sort of going your own way in the art world, but also that you weren't just like, you're a sculptor, but you weren't just sort of like making, facsimiles of the Pietà. You were doing this sort of innovative, forward-looking work. And that just really, really impressed me. So maybe we'll start there. Just sort of, how did you come to be doing what you're doing, both just in terms of your place in the art world and kind of your style? And then there are a million directions we can go from there.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I come from a pretty creative background. Both my parents are sculptors. They trained as sculptors. On either side, even further back, there's a lot of sort of artists in the family. So, I grew up as a young child watching my parents work, watching my parents sculpt, and being around their studio, being around that creative environment, which is, actually a wonderful thing for a child, because children are, naturally very much into making things and being creative. And of course, having two parents who were into that, I was endlessly given plasticine and clay and encouraged, like, oh, make things and da-da-da, and it was just, being sort of in that environment. And so, when people say, oh, how did you come to sculpture? It's like, well, I was born into it, and I didn't really see any other sort of direct route outside of that. It was like, I always kind of knew I was going to be in some sort of creative field and likely busy with my hands. And so, after that, to fast forward, you go through high school and then on to my first art school when I was like 17, and that was in Glasgow in Scotland. And that was an absolute disaster, because it was like my first 1 year there was really quite shocking, because it was my introduction to the hyper-conceptual world of contemporary art, and it really didn't fit, it didn't match at all. And then some family friends were like, look, you'd be better off at an academy. You should just leave Scotland and go to an academy in Antwerp. And in Belgium specifically, there was this academy called the Antwerp Royal Academy. It's 350 years old. It's got a pretty good heritage. Apply there and see what happens. And I applied, and it was a very, very difficult, at the time, very, very difficult 3-day exam, where you do like drawing and sculpting and all this stuff, and you're constantly sort of watched over to see if you're what they're kind of looking for. And then thankfully I got accepted, and after that it was like I felt like I was in the right place, because they were really teaching how to actually carve with stone, how to work with metal, how to learning anatomy, really the sort of skills that you would want to learn if you were to say, you can sort of make anything once you've got that general foundation and background. And so that was amazing. I went through that, and actually when I graduated, I immediately got picked up, and I was having shows, and it was actually I sort of hit the ground running, shall we say. Things were going really well. And then of course, it's probably not, I started to come on your radar, shall we say, because I started to break from I just couldn't take it anymore, shall we say, in the art world. I found it quite stifling, and I found it nauseating at how much, how you essentially had to have all of your work endlessly aligning with some sort of new left narrative. which I just I couldn't do, and I was constantly being asked, oh, join this group exhibition, but your work has to speak to this, or your work has to deconstruct something related to Western tradition. All of these sort of endless little tags that you see on everything today. And I was having these conversations with other artists because, like other painters and sculptors, and I was saying, look, guys, we don't have to go along with this, right? We should actually maybe do our own thing and break away from what's going on. But even when I released my manifesto in 2020, where I basically severed my connection to the art world and felt that it was important to get into something else, I wasn't joined. I had my sort of, if people know Yukio Mishima, I had my Yukio Mishima moment where I didn't convert. I didn't convert the army around me, shall we say, and they decided instead that they were going to remain acceptable, go along to get along, and obviously not have their shows taken away. But no, I mean, like I couldn't do that, and I felt that it was important to start something else, and I continue to do that, and it's growing from strength to strength, being on the outside doing something else.
If I could just follow up on that real quick before, I know, Bobby, you want to jump in, but Fen, I mean, what was it about you and your work? I mean, obviously you're a white male. I mean, that might be one thing in the art world today, but I mean, it seems like it has to be more than that. I mean, your work, for example, is very, there's this kind of, I mean, we want to get into this, but there's an energy to it. There's a kind of heroic feel to it. I mean, is it the work itself, or your materials, or your technique, or something? Was it all of the above that just sort of really bristled with the art establishment?
Absolutely, yeah. No, it was. I was endlessly having like little debates and quips with the art establishment and various directors and curators, and they were saying, but your work, it's a bit too masculine, or it's a bit too aggressive, or it's a bit too violent. They were using all these words, or they even regularly would throw this thing on it where they would say it's colonial, which I thought was always kind of like a hilarious thing, because I still to this day don't quite understand what they're on about. But they didn't like that I was a sculptor that was very much interested in basically picking up where the 1920s and 1930s sculptors had kind of left off, because just to give you, just to preface that, like, I've always believed that a sculptor's job, an artist's job, whatever, is to somehow connect to that story, that tapestry, if you want to use an overused word to this, and be able to grab that and throw it forward. And I wasn't able to find aesthetic material that I wanted to grab and throw forward in the kind of postmodern period of sort of the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s. I found all that quite boring, because it was hyper focused on momentary sort of day-to-day, week-to-week critique on things that I just didn't find exciting. And of course, postmodernism had very much attacked aesthetics, and I'm, as a sculptor, very much excited by aesthetics. I mean, if you look at the 1920s, 1930s, American Art Deco, all of this sort of stuff is so rich. And I feel like these sculptors and artists, they left a torch that was worth picking up. But not in the sense that, like, I look back at these guys and just want to endlessly sort of emulate what they were doing. I want to grab at bits of it and see if there's something fresh there. And that whole period is it's a muddied period, right? When you talk about 1930s Europe, you talk about 1940s Europe, or even if you talk about 1930s America, it's brash, it's powerful, it's unapologetic. There's a lot of masculinity in a number of the figures. There's this heroic depiction. It doesn't jibe well with an establishment essentially that is drunk on postmodernism and deconstruction, right? It's not something they wanted to see. Actually, just a funny story on that. Just before I fully got cancelled, I was invited to do a major show, which was going to be pretty big for my career. But it was really funny because I was reading the like the philosophical points behind the show, and it was going to be a major show in Antwerp, and I was going to be exhibiting alongside some major names. And it said, but your work has to speak to, and then it was like a list, and it was like climate change. It has to speak to the refugee crisis. It has to speak to, and it was like this list of things. And, you know, and I was saying to my wife at the time, it was like we were kind of reading this at the kitchen table, and I was like, but my work doesn't speak to any of these things. It really, it genuinely doesn't. I have no interest about making work that tracks onto those momentary issues that I just feel like there's far greater sort of archetypal things that I could be getting into rather than this sort of petty stuff, right? And so I just had to turn it down, and it was funny because I had, my like close people behind me who were working with me who were like, "But Fen, what are you doing? This is the moment you should have accepted. Like, are you mad?" I was just like, well, I can't live with myself. I genuinely can't live with myself if that's on my name, and life is short, and I think it's important that you try to stand for something while you're here, and that's what I'm doing, and that's what I'm running forward with,
Yeah. It's when you said that, it's when you try to speak to the moment or whatever the issue is, it no longer, I mean, people won't pay attention to that work in, say, 3 years. And it seems that, like, art's supposed to be all about having the eternal piercing through, the time, or in the infinite through finitude. Yep. I kind of have a little bit of a funny story too. My sister went through art school in Chicago, where I'm from. And I remember asking my sister once, I had to help her bring her piece into the gallery that she was showcasing her piece in. And I asked her, what are you paying the school for? You're not learning, they're not teaching you anything other than this kind of endless critique. She didn't like that too much. But it was like my way kind of into the thinking of the art world. And I used to always show my students this documentary. It was great, by Roger Scruton on beauty. Yes, I could only get on YouTube. Yes, I think they have like the Portuguese version. It's like Portuguese subtitles. It's the only thing on YouTube. I think they've banned it, but that's a great kind of introduction, at least for me, to what's going on in the art school. So for somebody who doesn't really know much about all these movements in the early 20th century, I mean, growing up in Chicago, walking around downtown Chicago, you start to think, what the heck? We had this great stuff, this Art Deco on LaSalle Street. And then all of a sudden, everything just seemed to go. What was that about? So maybe could you say a little bit about those early 20th century movements that you're not trying to, just imitate, but you're trying to, carry forward that legacy?
Sure. Absolutely. So, I mean, the major movements that I've become fascinated with, obsessed with, shall we say, is, you can look at, for example, I sort of bring these broadly together. You've got Italian Futurism, 1909, 1912, 15. You've got British Vorticism, same period. And then you've got later off that you've got Art Deco, right? And you had European Art Deco and you had American Art Deco. And this was like a broadly speaking, you could say a number of these movements were coming together, and it's what I like to consider, in some respects, Art Deco could be seen as like a classical modernism, right? It's taking sort of like the eternal elements of the classical world, classical lineage, and it's pushing those forward into a more modern language. So there was a lot of geometry being used, a lot of geometric force and form and different flow lines to be able to essentially speak to speed and the modern world, right? This is the machine age, okay? And this has captivated me because of this element of dynamism. And of course, you had the Italian futurists who were mad about the motor car, right? And dynamism and speed and flight and war and violence and all this kind of stuff. And then of course you had you had Wyndham Lewis, who was behind the Vorticist movement, and that's like kind of somewhat close to a British offshoot, although they weren't as mad about the machine as Marinetti's Vorticist movement. But they were, they're experimenting a lot with this sort of like aggressive force lines and explosive force and everything. And it was really about capturing a sense of vitality, movement, and experimental visual kind of progress, right? And, there will be a lot of people in the conservative circles or, right-wing circles or whatever you want to say, who will say, look, they really don't like that period because it was too experimental, it was too geometric. A lot of these guys also would say they don't like Art Deco or whatever. They prefer much earlier work, 1700s, Renaissance, 1500s, going further back, right? But if there's one thing that's always captured me that I kind of loved about that early modern 1920s, 1930s period, was that it was at least grabbing aspects of the past, accelerating it forward with a new kind of force and energy, and doing something quite brash and experimental. The sad reality is what ended up happening after the 1930s, going into the 40s, 50s, after Second World War. It was essentially a taboo to create sort of power aesthetics, right? It became associated with fascism, became associated with National Socialism. And so like so much of this element became taboo. You've also got to remember economic period changed. There's a lot of moving parts to all of this. If you look at Britain, for example, the Vorticist movement never fully took off. Why? Because World War I, we saw the massacre of young men by the machine. No one really wanted to celebrate this kind of like mechanized sort of thing. It's like there was a reason there. I think that it didn't quite land. That I think it's worthwhile saying that World War I, World War II really was kind of like it created a vacuum, and it sort of really sucked out the vitality from culture, thought, and a number of other areas. I mean, we also just lost some of our best. This is an absolute travesty, really. But that of course has major repercussions. And then you lead into the cynical age, and we're looking at the 60s, 70s. This hyper deconstruction, endlessly doubting ourselves, this neurotic sort of post-modernity mindset. Nihilism is the beating heart of nihilism has infected everything. And now I think we're at this point where I think a lot of people are irony poisoned by post-modernity and just being able to be serious, being able to be honest with things. It's like there is a kind of neurotic implant in a lot of people where they can't be serious anymore, and because it's always having to monitor yourself and monitor the culture you're making or being involved in, and maybe I'm doing something too seriously. It's a very muddy world now that we're in. But I've always looked back to that period as the last period, 1920s and 30s, the last period where there was some real aesthetic foundation, building blocks in a geometric way, but also a very much refined way. I call it a kind of classical modernism. It's the classical world meeting some aspect of the modernism, the machine age. And I find it a great source of inspiration. And I felt that it was important also to look at those periods because, you had people on the left who were saying, don't look into it, but you had people on the right saying, don't look into it. And so at a certain point, if both parties are saying, don't look into it, I feel like it's worthwhile looking into. And that has been my sort of major area of exploration for the past years.
Yeah, Bobby and I have talked in other podcasts and written as well about how we believe just so much meat was left on the bone from modernism.
True.
And I mean, some of our intellectual heroes are from the same period that you're describing. And one thing that can be frustrating, you've already hinted at this, but especially if you're kind of right of center, there can be a kind of skepticism about or even antagonism towards modernism. I mean, in theological circles, modernist is a kind of epithet. I mean, it's an insult, right? And we don't really think that way, honestly. And I've noticed that in some attempts, which are laudable, to kind of try to get something going in a kind of right of center vein in aesthetics, there can be, unfortunately, a kind of like, instead of frankly doing what you're doing, there can be something of like a pastiche. It's just a kind of like, trying to jump maybe too far back in the past and just kind of, you know, um, oh well, there was once a time when things were nice, and so let's just do that again, rather than picking up a point in the past where you can say, actually, we think everything kind of went wrong around this time, so
Yeah.
why don't we sort of go back to there and then maybe see where that will lead us forward. I don't know what your
Yeah.
thoughts are on that.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, look, I felt when, while I was studying art history and looking back through, you look back through time at this incredible Western canon that we call, it's infinitely rich. It's infinitely rich, and there is so much to it. And the thing that I was battling with, though, as like a young student, is I was thinking to myself, look, how we're in a difficult time. We struggle to be able to honestly reproduce a kind of classicism. We struggle to be able to honestly reproduce, this hyper refinement, or we can reproduce it, but it ends up falling flat because, like we're trying to bring the Italian Renaissance into a period that like we don't have the kind of incredible schooling. You have to remember that the Italian Renaissance sculptors, painters, they were bred. Okay, they were brought into this world by a family of artisans. They started, super young, drawing and sculpting, and their entire life was just sculpture. And now we're expected to try and meet that same world, from that kind of schooling, right? This is, and then also, really throw it forward. And that, I think, that is, in an atomized period when you don't have artists, painters, sculptors, patrons working as a unit like you had with the Medici families, in Italy, who were literally kind of bringing up artists like racehorses, like high pedigree racehorses, and playing them off one another in this incredible, in this incredible dueling of competence. And this is almost unheard of today in this period of equality and inclusion, where everyone is the same and equal, and all aesthetics are the same and equal, right? Or pretentiously so. And so I felt that there needs to be a foundation, and for me, the foundation that is both modern and ancient is geometry. And we can look back at geometry from the Greeks, the basic building blocks, all of everything from the Greek sculpture. If you look at their pedigree from the archaic, classical, Hellenistic, geometric, all of that period, you can see that they were always so interested in the basic building blocks of form and how that went up and refined. And so I wanted to apply the similar lens to look. We don't have to look that far back to see geometry being used again in a lot of this early modernist stuff. That's the building block. The building block of form is geometry, measurement, and how line is placed in space. And this was still being used at a masterful level in the 1910s, 20s, 30s. And I felt that, I've got many of the old manuals and books from that time that still hold this, great teachings and knowledge from that time. And you can look back to it and you can read through it and you can see how they were doing certain things. And it felt like a great pushing off point. And it, as you say, meat on the bone. Yes. I mean, there's still a lot of, let's say, aesthetic vocabulary that can be grabbed at and formulated and synthesized differently. And, like my critics will say, but, you're looking at that period, are you then simply just going to produce that? And I'm like, no, I mean, look, this is something that you get into, and then you create a series of works, and hopefully from there you find a kind of jumping off point with some sort of fresh aesthetic manifestation arrives. And I say that not in the sense of this is like even so much of a theory-based thing. It's like it goes through practice. When you're in the creative act, gradually you will have breakthroughs. Something else and fresh arrives. and then from there it will go on. But I've always known this is not something I can do on my own. So it's like I've been linking up with other artists and painters and sculptors across the world now and we've been having a few small successful exhibitions, for example, in London and stuff like that, to try and bring about a fresh kind of movement of other artists who are also getting into this similar period.
Could you say something about, okay, I want to pick up on that movement thing, and like your little, if you want to say, your little group that seems to be bringing some fresh air into the art world. But today in a lot of Catholic circles, you hear the term beauty just thrown about a ton. And in all honesty, I haven't really seen much stuff that I take to be beautiful coming out of that. I mean, anyways, that's just my I'm going to do like a Big Lebowski. It's just like my opinion, man. But I think that what I notice is kind of interesting. In all the stuff that I've read, you don't use the term beauty. And I found that quite fascinating. Is there anything to that?
The difficulty is the word beauty has become, I think it's become overused, and it often associates with something quite treacly sweet for me. And I do sometimes say, oh, that's beautiful or whatever, but I tend not to look at it probably in the same lens as a lot of other people broadly look at it. I see beauty in a sense of power and force in a composition, shall we say? And I'm more interested in displays of sort of dynamic force and energy as beauty, rather than simply a little girl on a swing in a painting, which is nice, but it's kind of treacly sweet, and I'm really in that respect. I'm what you could call an apologetic modernist in a sense, because I struggle. I think our period now struggles with the sense of beauty, and I say that, by the way, sadly, with sadness in my voice in many respects, because I think that it's become marred, and it's in many respects it's lost something. It's been used and abused, shall we say, by both sides of the equation now, and I tend to be more interested in what is powerful, what is forceful, what grabs my attention, what works as a composition. I get into countless debates with people who are, what they call themselves critics or whatever, and the most interesting debates that I can get into is like, look, why does this picture or this sculpture work? Let's get into the meat of like how a composition comes together. How is the eye being drawn through a piece of work? Why is it powerful? Why, and if you do get into that sort of thing, we're talking really compositional design here. You start to understand, like, this is how a piece works. This is how your eye is drawn through the crystalline, underlying, sort of mesh of a picture, right? Like, for example, that picture behind you there, I'll
tell you, there was a reason I didn't want to come to this room.
The painter has divided it up in a certain way that is, I mean, I'm not saying it's like an incredible painting, but I'm just saying there is thought there, because every composition has some level of thought, right? And usually relatively bad work has no real compositional thought going on at all. It's like a good artist, a great artist, or the best artists are obviously always thinking about how am I feeling something, and how am I then transmitting that out into the world where someone else can see that and experience it, and then be able to say, without a massive explanation, they can just feel, they can resonate with the work and say, that I'm feeling that archetype, I'm feeling that force, I'm feeling that. That's what the sculptor or painter was trying to convey. You see, and that of course is down to how a work is compositionally put together.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about some of your specific work and kind of the way that this has the way that what you're articulating plays out in your craft. I think the first thing that I ever noticed from you was your work Momentum, which is this incredible sculpture of a motorcyclist. And I was just looking at your website for some of the other ones that were familiar to me. Breakthrough, Blast. I think recently you've been working on some boxers.
Yeah.
You know, all of your pieces have this energy, this movement, this force, as you say. And you know, the boxers one strikes me because, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking about how, for example, I don't like mixed martial arts. I don't like it at all. I don't like it, but I love boxing. I think that even though I wouldn't necessarily say boxing is beautiful, but there is something, I don't know, there's something more poetic about it. There's something about it that to me is like worthy of kind of being captured in art. So that's just kind of a roundabout way of my pitching a question to you to kind of tell us about, you know, the way that you've kind of thought through some of these specific works.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the recent piece that I'm doing sketches of right now, which is what I shared recently on my social media on Twitter, is obviously it's depicting a figure landing a very successful punch on his opponent, and I enjoy the capturing that in a sort of an energetic and direct and explosive way. And you know, the way I really approach this sort of stuff is by making small models in clay or wax, and then, you know, arranging the figures in a certain compositional manner in which there is line and force to be able to sort of tell that visual story. And I'm often thinking about, you know, how can something be kind of like immediately transmitted? Like, how can it almost have a graphic immediate impact on the viewer? And that's what I really try to capture in a number of my works. And you know, you mentioned that Momentum piece, that figure on the motorcycle in movement. This is actually a conversation. You know, this brings me to an important point: is that as artists, all of your heroes are long gone usually, and you look back to them, and they join you as ghosts essentially, and especially in quietude. You know, when you're presented before the material, the work, you're often on your own in long hours of solitude. And around me, you know, I have books on various sculptors, artists, theorists, and you know, you read their material and you think, you know, you know, you sort of have conversations with them. You know, as mad as that might sound to some people, but you're in this conversation with ghosts. And while I was having this conversation with ghosts, shall we say, I was really enamored by the Italian Futurists and some of their very early paintings and drawings of motorcyclists. And they, you know, these things are very kind of sketchy and basic, but it's just a few blocky forms put together that's capturing essentially that blur, that kind of like, you know, motion blur. And it's a few forms. And I thought, well, if they could be with me now and I could have a conversation with them, because, you know, artists throughout time would, you know, someone would make a painting, kind of in my artist group now, someone makes a painting, I make a sculpture, they make a painting based on my sculpture, and we have this visual conversation. At this period in time when I was doing this, I didn't really have anyone that I could do that with, because a lot of the artists around me were very postmodern and conceptual. So I was really just this weirdo, kind of out on my own, doing this stuff on my own. And but at least I could find strength amongst ghosts. And I just wanted to be able to make this very large stone work and kind of engage with old drawings and a few old paintings that came out of the Italian Futurist circle. And I wanted to capture it as basically the epitome of forward force and momentum, and a civilization or a group of people who were basically unapologetically moving forward. I felt that piece captured that, and I wanted to be able to bring that dynamism into stone. And stone is, of course, a static material. It's very intimidating, trying to bring this feeling of kind of motion and almost lightness into it is a massive task. And this was around 3-4 tons of stone, and I was like, look, I want to get into this, and I really want to make this piece, and it was crazy, and I worked on it for months, and you know, I was actually so happy that it landed. You know, people felt it, and it really, you know, people really resonated with it. So I was very happy with that about that. But it was yeah.
Yeah, it's really marvelous. I mean, it's not the way that you, it's, you know, you could paint a painting or a sculpture, take a photograph even of a man and a motorcycle. I mean, there are all different ways you can do this, but the way that you capture the motorcycle in stone is, as you say, I mean, it's like almost like you just instantly, your mind tells you that thing is going as fast as it possibly can. Right. It's not like sort of downshifting. It's not, you know, it's not just sort of sitting somewhere. And I think that is really, really an amazing thing. And, you know, I mean, if you know, people have gone to museums and they've seen sculptures and they may have in their minds what it takes to kind of sculpt something. But, you know, when you really step back and listen to someone like you talk and imagine taking a giant block of stone and turning that into an experience for someone where they're sort of feeling speed it's extraordinary. It really is. So
well,
bravo.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate that. No, it's wonderful, really. You know, I think that's really the magic of it. You know, you when you're making art and you're making sculpture, you're in this solitudal period and you're making it and you sort of love it. And of course you never know how it's going to land when it goes out into the when you have your show and it goes out into the world. But you love it, right? So it's a funny thing because I've had other younger artists who ask me and they say, they'll say, oh, but I'm scared to show my work. And I'm like, well, do you like it? Are you really into it? And they're like, well, yeah, I like it. I'm like, well, sure. Like this is one of the most important things is, you know, like, have you served it? You know, have you served it and the vision, and have you been true to it? And you haven't compromised, and you haven't tried to impress that girl next door, or you haven't, you know, all of these kind of superficial things that a lot of artists unfortunately fall into, or trying to impress the gallerist or some collector or everything. You know, these are the things that muddy the creative process. You should ultimately stay true to what it wants. And that sounds kind of a bit wokey, weird, and strange to say that kind of stuff, but really what I'm saying is that a work will demand something of you and you must serve it. And you know, you serve the idea, you serve the energy, and you serve the force, and then after that you pass it out to the world, and you step away, and you know, you've hopefully loved the experience, and perhaps it's broken you in the process of it, and sometimes work does do that. But as long as you've stayed true to it, that I think is really key.
When I saw that piece, I thought of, you know, the scene from The Dark Knight when Batman is chasing the Joker and he's on the bike. And I mean, it's just kind of fitting though, because that's on LaSalle Street where you have, you know, the Chicago Board of Trade,
yes,
the Art Deco. And I love the kind of the positioning of the motorcycle there. But could you say something too about one of your more recent pieces called The Sower?
Yeah.
And I see that you were inspired by the American Art Deco scene with that. Could you say a little bit about that? Because I think, you know, a lot of people, I mean, that's, I think, perhaps my favorite time period in architecture, and it's just so fruitful. So can you say something about the piece The Sower and how it connects to the American Art Deco?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is again another conversation with a ghost, but one of my heroes, actually, Lee Laurie, who was actually, and I find this very sad, but so many of these great sculptors, in fact, of that period are kind of forgotten, lost and forgotten in many respects. You know, I think we should spend more time remembering them, because they did incredible things. And Lee Laurie, you know, for people who might be wondering, Lee Laurie was actually the sculptor behind Atlas, the Titan that stands at the Rockefeller Building. But he had an incredibly successful career, and he was known as essentially an architectural sculptor. I mean, he wasn't just, you know, putting together shows and having exhibitions. he was working very much with various industrialists and big picture thinker men, and basically decorating their buildings, making incredible pieces of sculpture and relief work for also various church work. He did some really incredible work, in stone and relief. It was just incredible. And so I thought to myself, look, I've been invited to work on this piece in South Carolina, and it's an amazing setting there with this housing development. And these guys, they who run this development company, Keen Development Group, they contacted me and they said, look, we love your work, we love your story and what you're trying to fight for. Would you be interested in flying out and having a discussion and thinking about this project with us? And I was like, yeah, totally. I mean, I just fell in love with their vision, and it was refreshing to see a development firm that were basically that was coming forward and saying, like, why don't we make why don't we actually make a focus on some sculptural work at this development? And that's a breath of fresh air, because there's not too many people thinking like that. And so I flew out, and I was looking at the space, and it's set in Greenville in South Carolina. And I was actually really impressed by the place. I was like, wow, this is such a wonderful area. And I met with the mayor, and we had all these different conversations, and I was interested about the story of what was going on and seeing the transformation that Greenville had gone through quite rapidly, actually, since the 1980s. And anyway, I'm going to cut a long story short. I was impressed, and I thought, wow, this is really exciting. And we had no idea what we were going to make, and they were like, oh, if you could just come up with a few ideas. And I was like, oh, thinking it through. And I just loved the transformation that was going on there, and I thought it was incredible. Greenville is sort of like a very optimistic, very high energy place, and there's a lot of change going on there. And I felt with this development that it was something fresh, in the sort of American scene of what was going on, and it felt fitting to touch on the same archetype that Lee Laurie had touched on. This is back in the 1930s, 40s period. And I wanted to touch on the subject of the sower. And of course, the sower is a great Western canon archetype. It connects to the parable of the sower. It connects, people see it from various different archetypal lights for the growth of something, or the changing of something, or or going from one state to another, or even this idea of time. It felt like a very important symbol to get into, and that was rich within the Western canon, because it also goes back to Van Gogh, and so it's like many artists throughout the Western canon have gone and touched on the sower. So I thought, this is something I really wanted to get into. So I did, working with my team, we did a number of different drawings and concept work, and then I, was creating multiple little models and everything else. And then eventually we sort of landed on this this design, which is of course like just a tiny little, it's a tiny little thing now, but that has to go through now several more layers of development as I then sort of tweak the other various, aesthetic points and making sure the balance and harmony is correct. But I'm super excited about this. This is going to be moving forward into the next stages in the next couple of months now, and then it's probably going to be another sort of good year of work. And then this piece is going to be standing, I think, around about 8 to 10 feet. So it's going to be a nice bronze work, actually. Yeah.
Wow. That brings me to ask you sort of more generally about public art, because, yeah, as you say, Greenville is, I've been to Greenville. It's a wonderful city, and it's a really up and coming American city that I think provides hope, really, for our country. And so it's wonderful that you're creating this sort of hopeful kind of piece. But public art elsewhere is often just so awful. Whether it's like the fourth plinth at Trafalgar Square, or whether it's sorry, Bobby, but the bean sculpture thing in Chicago, or whatever it may be. Public art just has this sort of reputation nowadays as being generally something people don't want to look at, you know but it certainly didn't used to be that way. I mean, cities were very proud of the things that they erected in their public spaces. So I don't know. What are your feelings sort of about the way that that's developing more generally?
Well, I have to think of my great hero Wyndham Lewis, because Wyndham Lewis, he was the man behind the Vorticist movement. But Wyndham Lewis, he delivered a great short speech on getting into the essentials of art and aesthetics, right? And again, to cut a long story short, one of the things that I thought was really great in this speech is he talks about sort of the unknowingness of aesthetics on our eye, and how essentially our ear is probably more perceptive than our eye to stimulus, right? So, but wherever we go, our eye is reading an aesthetic signature. You walk around a city, and you're picking up on certain harmonious elements, or rather ugly elements, and this is knowingly or unknowingly in most cases essentially lowering you. It's lowering your. I think it has a major effect on your spirit. Actually, I genuinely do believe that, and it's essentially putting you on a sort of a downgraded energetic level. And it's something that I've often said, is that I sort of believe that art either does two things to me. It either sort of it lifts my spirits or lowers them. And unfortunately, in today's world, I can go through multiple cities, and the public art is just, it lowers me. It doesn't lift me, and it doesn't touch on something that I feel is profound or important. It doesn't act like an anchor. I mean, this is something that I think is very, very important to understand, is like what actually is a piece of public sculpture. It is a civilizational, cultural anchor of a people, and it speaks an important archetypal symbol into the world, and it is held there in a static material, and it forever plays that music, shall we say. It forever tells that story. This is important because if you're going to litter your city with mundane visual stories, then one cannot be surprised by the sort of hopelessness that I think many people start to feel, and this disconnected quality, because public art and art outside has always been able to at least tie a place, a people, to something more profound or deeper in their history. This is if you really get into this stuff, it's extremely important. It's extremely important. This is not a game here. And our ancestors not that long ago knew that this was really genuinely important, right? And Wyndham Lewis in his speech, he talks about unfortunately how things are changing. This is even back then. He's talking about, this is sort of a speech, I believe, from the 1950s, and things are rapidly changing even back then. And if they were changing back then, we are absolutely at breakneck speed now. But I also do think that this moment is pregnant with multiple futures that can be born, and I don't necessarily think that they have to be, they don't have to continue to be as poor aesthetically and artistically as they have been for quite a while now. So, yeah, I mean, I'm rambling now, but yeah.
No, I mean, I think, something that I think you've talked about before too is, I liked what you were just saying about how, a piece of art sort of either elevates you or depresses you. And I think like there's nowhere where that should be kind of more the case than in a piece of public outdoor art, something that just people can't help but interact with. And, so yeah, if it's like, whatever it is, this bean in Chicago, which is like, like there, or here's another example, the bull at Wall Street, right? So there's this bull, which is a very interesting piece, right? But then
Yeah.
they come along and they say, well, let's put this little girl standing in front
Yeah.
of the bull as some kind of statement about some way of stopping the bull. I mean, so clearly people want public art to kind of say something or whatever, but like, do we want to pass by it and go, oh, that's cute, or oh, isn't that neat? I can take a picture that creates this weird effect or whatever. Or do we want to pass by it and sort of, maybe even in a kind of unintelligible way, or some way that we can't quite put our finger on, just sort of feel uplifted or inspired in some way, for lack of a better way of putting it, woken up even, for all that we talk about woke, wokeness or whatever. There's nothing wrong with actually art that wakes us up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I couldn't agree more. Sorry, go ahead, Robert.
No, Andrew, you said that actually the bean, I forget the actual, no one remembers what the actual name
It's actually
of the
called the
piece
Cloud
is.
Gate. It's called the
Yeah.
Cloud Gate, by the way. Yeah.
But if you look at all of the different pieces that were potential pieces, Jeff Koons actually had a piece that was supposed to be in that spot, which is like, everybody meets there. It's like, in some ways for Chicago, like the center of the city. It was going to be a slide that you could just, I guess you could participate in that art, but just a slide. Speaking of Jeff Koons, at the Art Institute of Chicago, in the new kind of like modern exhibit there, they have a Jeff Koons piece. It's a bust of Jeff Koons and his wife, who was an Italian porn star. But next to that, I remember walking through this. There was it's just a pile. I thought that actually somebody left a mess. It was a pile of stuffed animals on the floor, and everybody in the Art Institute of Chicago was looking at that contemplatively, as if there was something to gaze at. And I kind of joined the crowd, and there was a security guard standing there. This kind of this big woman, just very serious. And I asked her, I said, maybe we should call the janitor because somebody just left all their stuffed animals on the floor. I just, the minute when you describe what the thing is, you're already giving a judgment on it. And it's just shocking to me. I don't know if we could bring up all the examples that Roger Scruton goes through in that beauty documentary about the piece with the glass on the shelf, it being an oak tree.
Yeah.
But I remember hearing you say something that the piece itself should be saying something already. You don't need to describe it for the audience. So maybe that is the very thing. Why did we become so language focused in the art world?
I mean, look, this is something that you can map directly on, sort of going into 1950s, 1960s, out of Second World War. You obviously had this very sort of you had the School of Deconstruction, of course, and you had people talk about the Frankfurt School, or we talk about a lot of the people behind postmodernism, or there is this endless critique on sort of Western tradition, or the Western canon, or aesthetics, and all of this kind of hyper over intellectualized, I would say actually at times pseudo intellectual mumbo jumbo, which is endlessly sort of looking to critique and tear down and destroy, one could say, various archetypal elements of the Western civilization, I think is the way to look at it. But the issue is that words have a corrosive element to things, or they can do. And so you can dismantle beautiful ideas with words, but it's you pull the wings off a butterfly, and you pull the legs and wings off a butterfly, and you end up essentially with a maggot. And the issue is that postmodernity has done this to aesthetics. It's done this to so many of our important elements and archetypal things within our traditions, that essentially The issue I have is that they haven't built anything fresh and new out of that. And I do favor radical ideas, and I do favor revolutionary ideas at times, and I do rather like aspects of maybe something fresh and new can arrive. But if you're only going to destroy, but not actually build, this has both a micro and a macro aspect to it, because when it comes to art criticism, art critics, for example, used to be able to tell you why certain paintings and sculpture worked on an aesthetic level. Postmodernity can't even engage with the aesthetics, but it will talk about the theoretical level that the work is supposed to be talking to. There has been a major disconnection here. I believe that this is, in fact, a subversion of art, because you've taken it from the aesthetic into the theoretical, and it has resided within the theoretical for the best part of 60, 70 years. And I'm talking about mainstream sort of like standard art, what we call contemporary art or whatever. And that's really not the kind of conversation that even like the early modernists were having. They were still engaged in the aesthetics. And I've thought about this quite often, because I've had various spats with hyper postmodern types, and they'll say, "Oh, but why would you focus on this? And your work, why does it speaks to speed? Why is that important? It speaks to this sense of strength, or all these different kind of things." And I'm like, well, why don't you approach the aesthetic with me? Why don't you tell me why the work isn't working? Or why don't you show me a vision of what could work? Or why don't you show me a vision of the future of what art could be? Silence. You never get an answer, because they only operate within the theoretical. These people can't paint, can't draw, can't sculpt. And, it's like a number of the early modernist painters and thinkers and writers, they had this idea of like, look, you don't take criticism from people who've never actually made any substantial work themselves. This is lunacy. This is madness. And so the issue is that so much of the critique that's going on today is thrown at you by wordsmiths who can bamboozle you with all this theory, but they don't show a way forward. They only destroy. And this is the issue that we have with our time. I have had arguments on the street at my exhibitions, and I've had arguments online with various people who have attacked me. And I say, look, my work might not gel with you, it might not fit with you, but what's the way forward then? And there is always silence. And so we reside now in this period where I think we're trying to grab aspects and elements of various different things and trying to find a fresh way. What is our moment now? I feel like our moment is there's a vast amount of confusion. We are accelerating forward at a breakneck speed. And we've got, the potential of this, AI systems and all kinds of extraordinary things right here. And as I say, this moment is pregnant with multiple futures. Where does that go? Who's writing about it? How are they writing about it? Who's making the music for this moment, this time? What is going forward? Because what's important to understand is whatever happens now and into the future when it comes to art, it might look different, but it can carry the timeless archetypes of the Western canon through and into this moment and forward. It's something that I often said is like, we don't have to simply depict works from the past, how they were depicted there. Their spirit, their essence can be, again, pregnant in a material, but have a different sort of aesthetic outflow into this moment and into the future. And I think that's really important. That's really key.
Extremely well said, Fen, and I think we'll just have to leave it there for now. With I hope a seed sown in the minds of our listeners and viewers, as we extremely well said. I mean, we really are in this pregnant moment. It's kind of a time for those who are creative, for those who are interested in the intellectual life, for those who have any kind of influence to begin to kind of really move and make some decisions. So we're really, really grateful that you shared your time with us today. So thank you, Fen, for joining us.
It was a pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Again, our guest today has been Fen de Villiers, who is based in Antwerp, Belgium. We will link to his website in the show notes. And to all of our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for supporting us. Please do check out our website, spacesalviinstitute.com. We've got a donate button there. You can click that and contribute to our work. Please do look out for all kinds of new things that will be coming your way shortly. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, please do share this episode with a friend and leave us a comment or ask us a question on our YouTube page. For now, may God bless you all and live in hope.